Hi, I'm Peter Miller, and I'm Dean of the Bard Graduate Center. And I'm here today with Hanna Hölling to talk about her new book, Object, Event, Performance, Art, Materiality, and Continuity Since the 1960s, which is forthcoming in Cultural Histories of the Material World. Hanna is a professor at University College London who works on contemporary art and conservation. She was trained as a conservator and was a visiting professor at the beginning of Cultures of Conservation at the Bard Graduate Center, where she also curated an exhibition, Zen for Film, about Nam June Paik, who has been the subject of her research. She published a book about him with University of California Press. So we're very excited to have her here today, and I'm looking forward to talking about conservation with you. So my first question, Hanna, is that your book makes the case that Fluxus and its kind of peer movements in the 1960s constitute a kind of significant break in the history of art with wide implications. Could you sketch out some of these wide implications for us?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for the questions, most of all. In the 1960s, I think there was a general kind of departure, or late 1950s already, a general departure from conventional kind of ways of art making, and new modes of artistic expression started to be articulated through happening, for instance, performance, video, experimental film, Fluxus activities, and emerging practices of media art. And all of these forms question the idea of a static object that endures unchanged and thus must be subject to a singular, interpretation. These works really pose particular questions when it comes to defining what and how exactly there is, both physically and conceptually, and what should be preserved. And I think that Fluxus especially involved a kind of radical break with what art was or could be. It's innovation, one could say, light in the novel conception of not only the artwork, but also of the artist. Fluxus was about activism, avant-gardism. Fluxus festivals were principal modes of operation of Fluxus. Fluxus was very much about collectivism and the individualization of works and of authorship. Fluxus really moved away. Fluxus and the movements or the attitudes of these times, they moved away from authorial model into a collective one. Early Fluxus, as I said, very much the proto-Fluxus is very much about collectivism. Then Fluxus started to produce multiples and later performances. Art became a social project made by all and for all. George Machunas and the Fluxus impresarios ideology wasn't accepted as such by everyone. He had many people who spoke against his ideology. What Fluxus did and what the attitudes in this time did was also a rejection of the notion that art is a process that generates unique objects. And this is really fascinating, especially for the questions that the book poses. Also, another kind of fascinating aspect of this time was that the movements or these attitudes introduced new materialities. Fluxus really rejects representation and clings to its material specificity. For instance, Yoko Ono's Apple, which decayed, was just about this decay. It was not about symbolization. It didn't symbolize, Garden Eden or the eternal sin, but it was about the sort of kind of degradation and decaying of its own self. It smelled, one could taste it, one could hear this art, and one could also see it. There was also something that happened to the experience in the art of this time. the experience that was important was the primary experience over secondary experience. Primary experience is very much the feel of the work, so what the work really is, rather than the mental concept of it. In that terms, one could say that this art really complicated Western metaphysics. As I say, you know, the art that decayed or disintegrated, the sort of kind of disintegrating materials could be conceptualized within what we think now about vibrant materiality. Vibrant materiality, you know, par excellence, that offers a different form of aesthetic experience. This attentiveness to the material presence of the work, whether long or short-lived, and perhaps I will have a chance to address it a little bit later. It's kind of base materiality suppressed, you know, the dominance of visuality in this art. And here we come to the point where, you know, the ocular-centric model that ruled the Western aesthetics was overcome. You know, the works started to be tactile, auditory, textual, olfactory. Sometimes, you know, the immersion or synesthesia or embodied encounter were essential to this work's experience. One of the other factors that changed, or that was so very, very important in the art of this time, was that many of these works started to be score notation or instruction based. You know, there is a whole kind of chapter one could write, and I'm actually writing a chapter on this in my new book, but about works which are score or notation based. But one could very quickly state that these works actually started to be very open, indeterminate, you know, processes that allowed for multiple realizations. And these posed fascinating questions for their continuity. You know, how can we continue these works? Can we at all, for instance, speak of conservation of these forms in the traditional sense? Is the notion of conservation still, you know, a valid notion, or should we rethink it? Another kind of fluxus innovation was the fluxus event. A fluxus event is something ephemeral, you know, a short durational art form that can be realized or could be realized, but could be also imagined. So the question here is also, you know, how to theorize such a work and how to go about its conservation if a work exists only in the imagination. For my kind of theoretical work, I think one of the most important factors in the art of that time is the kind of change this works experience. So change and transition become a fundamental quality of this works. And if this is so, if we assume that this is true, and I could, you know, give several examples here, and the book provides many of them in 10 chapters, a question must be posed: how much change can an artwork tolerate before becoming something else? No? So if change is allowed, how much is permitted before the work becomes a different piece? So this brings to the fore, you know, the aspects of authenticity. Can we conceive of this post-1960s works in terms of traditional authenticity or originality? Can we, you know, speak about, can this change tell us something about the identity of these works? When can change undermine, you know, the work identity, and so on? And I think, you know, that these works, as I mentioned already, pose huge problems or challenges to conservation. They call for a rethinking of the conservation paradigm more generally. I think that to conserve such work or such works is to imagine again and again, in a way, you know, such work, and to perform a mental work. And this book does it on several levels.
So that was a really wonderful tour of the horizon of the book. I want to follow up on a couple of particular points out of that kind of rich, suggestive array that you offered. For those who study material culture, but don't engage much with contemporary art, how do you think their work could benefit from thinking about an object as an event?
Well, thank you. Well, this is really a really fascinating question and something that has occupied me for a long, long time. I think that, the temporal questions or the questions about time generally, which your question poses, is important to everyone who engages with, seriously with thinking about materiality, material culture, and artworks as a part of this broader, I think, horizon of material culture. Thinking about an object as an event, I think, suggests, first of all, a temporal idiom, right? It implicates an engagement with durational art forms that require a contestation with time. It also, I think, encourages everyone who is interested in material culture to reflect on the concept of time and temporality in artworks and artifacts. We often, understand time as a method of measurement, no? The time of clocks, machines, scientific apparatuses, historic chronologies, industry or labor. And this is a form of a ready-made, I would say, temporality that obscures human and objects' existence in time. Artworks and artifacts, in my view, exist in time in multiple ways. They can manipulate time and they can process time. So can we also perceive them in a way as being in time outside of this object event, binary? And I think that change that I addressed earlier as changeability, change complicates this distinction between object and event. Change as an index of time tells us also something about the object itself. Everything changes. Traditional objects change just as well as, as newer or the post-1960s objects. In traditional object, change is much more sometimes slower rather than fast. So, if we accept change as a sort of kind of inherent quality of artworks and artifacts, this ideation that artifacts, are fixed and static is false, basically, right? They are durational, they are events, they are performances, they are processes. So seen from this perspective and really on a kind of temporal axis, I always try to draw it for my students. On the one hand, on this axis, there is an object, a sort of assumed static or fixed, which is untrue, obviously, but something that, changes slower. On the other side of this axis, there is event, which changes very quickly, which has this quality of occurring and disappearing and changing very, very intensely and quickly. We cannot think about an object as something that, is fixed and static. It is just a process or, a longer process or a slowly happening event, if you wish. So to see an object as an event is also to understand that all artifacts are in the process of the so-called permanent impermanence. The only permanence, that there is impermanence, right? If there is any fixity about this is this kind of permanent impermanence. They move and change in time, sometimes slower, sometimes fast and more intense. So there is no, in that sense, an ephemeral work, or a permanent work. Rather, there is only a relative duration of the impermanent. And I take this from Stuart Brisley, a British performance artist. And I think, it might be very well applied to all artifacts. If we think about, I don't know, performances, in ethnographic performances, or performances, how folklore studies think about performances. This can be just as well applied to them as a sort of kind of broader material culture study object, and to contemporary artworks and artifacts that I am more familiar with. So this also, this kind of thinking about time or relative duration of the impermanence takes us also away from the notions of authenticity and originality, or the original or authentic condition, because these are notions that, in my view, tended to rely on this linear conception of time, the kind of original moment that can be returned to, a paradigm of traditional conservation, which now is obviously questioned quite critically, but nonetheless, there is still, while I was studying, quite a lot of conservation documentation on narratives, different essays addressing works of art, traditional works of art or recent. There is this implied idea that there is a state of an artwork that can be returned to, or an instance that is original or authentic. So thinking about works, within this temporal idiom that I propose as objects, as performances, events, or as faster or slower happening events, helps us out of this, I think, concept. And and I think that it helps us also to rethink time in conservation in general, and this is as important to material culture studies scholars as to scholars who engage with more recent artworks, post 1960s, for instance.
And that actually, Hanna, brings us directly to the final question I wanted to ask you, and that is, you were trained as a conservator. And you've taught about conservation at the BGC and elsewhere. How do you think about object-event performance as intervening directly in thinking about the future of conservation?
Yeah, I think that the object-event performance intervenes really on two levels. It proposes, most of all, a new understanding of the object of conservation, and then, a new understanding of conservation itself. So on the object and on material level, I think that I already addressed several of these aspects in answering your former questions, but the works discussed in the book really exhaust the limits of conservation by being, changeable, by being short or long duration, by being, by recurring, for instance, by having to be installed and deinstalled, by having to be supplemented with new technologies, the processes of migration, interpretation, or emulation in new media art, for instance, or recoding, rewriting of a program. So on the object level, I think that the book proposes quite a lot new thinking, for a kind of, different future perhaps of conservation. The book also revises the traditional notions of conservation and museum collecting practices that's built upon a conception of a static object, something that I already mentioned, or the sort of kind of immobile artifacts. As I said, the material is far from still, from being inert. It is active and potent, right? We can say that it is incommensurate with the traditional approaches to perpetuate objects as impassive and dormant, the kind of, lumps of unruly because continuously degrading matter. And conservation here, for me, and through this chapter, really emerges as a form of creative, interventive, and generative process that carries forward and perpetuates making. So this is, a different kind of view on conservation, I think. Conservation also, emerges as a sort of as an act of identity construction, which is discursive. And that's when we start to read back an artwork to its origins by following linear trajectories or seeking the artwork's original form in the mind of the maker. It all seems very ineffective all of a sudden, because making, as put forward in this book or through this chapter, is never finished. It is interconnected and systemic. And I think that on the conservation level, the book really puts forward an acceptance of the many cultures of conservation, the many cultures, approaches, and attitudes. Conservation, for me in the past was always kind of, or has been for me, a set of dichotomies, of hands and minds, practice and theory, hard sciences and humanities, and the tangible and the intangible, and the traditional and the new. And the knowledge of conservation, in my view, is precisely for this reason so valuable, because it conjoins so many viewpoints. It can be learned, so much can be learned, within conservation, from conservation of different specialisms, from different attitudes and cultures within conservation. If we only think about, for instance, architectural preservation, archaeological conservation, ethnographic conservation, and so forth, or time-based media conservation, or the new discourses in the performance conservation. There is such richness of knowledge, and and such a potential for development of future discourses within the discipline itself. But there is also, a huge sort of potential in the dialogue between conservation and other disciplines. And obviously coming, from the BGC's Cultures of Conservation project, where, as you mentioned, I was involved between 2013 and 15. I came to appreciate the exchanges between, anthropologists, historians, art historians, and archaeologists, also scientific conservators, and humanist conservators, as myself, and found that the knowledge that can be built, from this dialogue is just something very special, and something that we need to sort of kind of preserve itself. And one of my books that I recently edited with Francesca Bauer and Katharina Amann, The Explicit Material, actually strives to kind of provide this perspective already, on the knowledge of conservation from the different perspectives as well. But what the BART book, and the book on which we are working right now, does, it is to allow non-conservators, to have a voice in the formation of the conservation discourses, one could say. So the book really engages with narratives by performance studies scholars, art historians, and different other specialisms and scholarly perspectives on what I call continuity of things, and especially the post-1960s artworks in this case. So, it strives to acknowledge conservation in a way as a valid theoretical and disciplinary framework that can be assessed and operated by both conservators and non-conservators. But also, it allows non-conservators to take stand, right? To explicitly take stand. And I think that this is quite novel, perhaps, on the horizon of publication in these terms. Yeah, and right now, I just mentioned, my time at BGC, which was so very, very shaping for me. But also now in my work at UCL and in the History of Art department, I come to understand even more, this kind of interconnectedness and the benefits of disciplinary and interdisciplinary dialogues, and dialogues also between different professions, having, different museums on the campus of UCL. We teach classes together with curators and different professionals that also act on the borders of conservation, how they views on keeping material things, or the sort of kind of legacy of the 1960s as well. We have a little collection of Fluxus publications, how that expands view on this type of materials, and also expands view on conservation. In my activity at Bern, now where I became research professor in 2018, I also strive to connect, these different perspectives of conservators working in conservation science, or conservators working in new media with new approaches to performance art, for instance, and more traditional materials. So there is so much that can be done, for the future of conservation, which this book puts forward, but also which is happening, and it's just there to be noticed, that it's worth our attention. And I think I see, just summarizing conservation, future, conservation as a way of theorizing, let's say, of bringing objects to conscious attention, of making them apparent. And I believe that there is, a huge need for a meaningful theorization of conservation.
Hanna, thank you so much. It's inspiring to listen to you talk, and it's exciting to think about this new book, Object, Event, Performance, Art, Materiality, and Continuity, since the 1960s. We've been talking today with Hanna Hölling. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Peter.